Welcome back, everybody. Brian David Marshall, pleased to be joined by Pro Tour Avison Restored champion Alexander Hayne. Alex, no secret here, right? You love a control deck.
I do.
And you're really looking for any excuse to play a control deck.
Yeah, I think if all things are equal, then I'll usually pick the control deck.
So there have been some shake-up to Modern. We had some new cards introduced. Right. We had some cards banned. We had a new card unbanned. What happens there that makes you think, yes, it's time to play control?
Well, Birthing Pod being banned is definitely a big thing. That, it was a deck that was another deck that required a specific set of answers, and it's hard to grind out the value that Pod would get you, as well as like the Treasure Cruise decks would also get a huge amount of card advantage. And as a control player, you're trying to answer their threats and then play some card advantage spell of your own to pull ahead, and it's very hard when they have the better spells than you do, basically.
Right. Okay, so we're going to talk about Jeskai Control. This is a deck that's been a big part of Modern. We've seen it do well at the World Magic Cup level. We've seen it do well on the Pro Tour. We've seen it sort of straddle Splinter Twin. Talk to us about the early game for a Jeskai Control deck here. I see some counter spells. I see a Wall of Omens. What are you trying to do?
So you're trying to basically trade 1-for-1 with your opponent's cards with cheap removal and counter spells, like Remand, Mana Leak, Spell Snare, and you play a Wall of Omens so you can block their Well in the Cattle or something, or maybe you have to Lightning Bolt it or something. And so you basically are playing these cheap spells to deal with what your opponent's doing because you have a better late game than them, so you want to prolong the game if possible.
Sure, so when we take a look at the next cards, we'll see some of the cards you already mentioned. Lightning Bolt, Path to Exile, still like almost a continuation of the early game. Like those 6 cards that are there kind of straddle early and mid, right? Like you're just countering and burning and pathing and doing whatever you need to do to get to your late game. Right.
Yeah. You're kind of treading water a bit, so to speak. Your opponents are playing, Wild in the Cattles, and you're playing Lightning Bolts, and that way you're treading water because you'll take a couple hits because the bolts might be slower than Nat Cattles or what have you. Like play the Wall of Omens and it costs 2, whereas the Nat Cattle costs 1. But eventually you're trying to kind of trump a lot of your opponent's cards.
Now, is this the feeling that once you get to the point where you've reached the Cryptic Command stage of the game, that we're about to enter the end game? Do you feel like you're about to start turn a corner?
Yeah, I think Cryptic Command is one of the cards that lets you really turn the corner, and it provides card advantage. So once you've stabilized kind of their early threats, then they play their next threat, and you get to Cryptic, usually, let's say, counter draw, and that pulls you ahead 1 card, and just the tiny advantages add up, as well as if you need to get to your later spells, you can tap down their team or bounce something that you weren't able to deal with earlier. So Cryptic's a really important card for turning the corner.
And Cryptic Command, and in fact all these spells that we've talked about, can be a part of the late game here because you have a card like Snapcaster Mage, which lets you now for 6 mana cast a Cryptic Command, or for 3 mana cast a Lightning Bolt out of your graveyard.
Right, Snapcaster Mage is one of the real draws to play this deck. You have a lot of cheap removal spells and cheap counter spells. So Snapcaster on turn 3 is often going to rebuy a counter, let's say a Spell Snare or a Lightning Bolt, and that way you're left with a 2-1, so you pull ahead again. And in the late game, Snapcaster giving Cryptic Command flashback, countering their spell and bouncing the Snapcaster can be a very, very powerful engine.
So folks at home have probably heard of the Pavlovian reaction. I want you to watch Alexander Hayne smile when I talk about the idea of Restoration Angeling a Snapcaster Mage to get the Snapcaster Mage to flashback another spell. Is that really where you like to live when you're playing Magic?
Definitely. I love some value, and that's pretty much as good as it gets. And Restoration Angel with Wall of Omens is also great, and that's why it's one of the premier threats in the deck, along with Vendilion Clique, which allows you to keep up counter mana against like the unfair decks, as well as putting a clock on them. And Vendilion's also some good disruption.
Right. So, we don't really go into all the lands in these little pieces we've been doing on the decks, but Celestial Colonnade is one of those cards lets you, you get to keep playing out your lands and doing stuff and fixing your mana, but in the end, that's often the card that's taking the last swing of the game.
Yeah, Celestial Colonnade is your ultimate endgame trump. The fact that you have more mana lands than most decks, and that your mana lands are bigger because most of them are 3/3s or 3/4s or something, and Colonnade having Vigilance means you just get to smack them with the Colonnade and often have it black to block a lot of their smaller creatures, which you thereby invalidate. Like, if they have a Signal Pest and a Memnite, they can attack you and you'll probably block the Signal Pest or the Memnite and you'll take a damage or nothing if you're blocking the Memnite, but you'll still have your Colonnade, and kind of that allows you to get virtual card advantage.
Talk to me just really quickly before we let you get back out to the floor. How many lands do you want to be playing in a Jeskai Control deck? Like, what's the sweet spot?
Well, you want a lot of lands.
Yeah.
It's a very mana-hungry deck, and I think you don't really see lists with less than 26 lands. 26, 27, I think, is a sweet spot. You get to play other utility lands as well, so that you don't flood out too much. Like Tectonic Edge, for instance, can deal with your opponent's threats, and like if they're mana lands and color screw them occasionally, it makes your mana leaks better and going into the late game, things like that. But generally, your lands are more valuable than your opponent's going later, so you want to just keep them in play so that you can attack with more colonnades or play Sphinx's Revelation and really put the game out of control.
You're doing that in Modern too?
Yeah, well, Sphinx's Revelation is great in every format.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Alexander Hayne signing off from the Tournament Center. I'm Brian David Marshall.